Hello, everybody. I'm Eshan Pokhrel,
And my name's Cameron Cummings.
and welcome back to the PB Political Podcast. Before today's episode, we wanted to share with you the change of direction both the podcast and PB Political will be undertaking to better cover the 2024 election season. Our podcast will now be exclusively covering the elections, including episodes with experts, such as today's with Kyle Kondik, candidates, youth leaders, community leaders, anybody and anything related to the 2024 elections, which are shaping up to be the most important elections of our lifetime. We thank you guys all for listening and are excited to move forward with PB Political and continue being a trusted news source for all of our readers and listeners. Thank you and enjoy the episode. And joining us today is elections expert and managing editor of Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, Kyle Kondik. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Kyle has a great column at the centerofpolitics.org, I believe, and always it's fun to talk to you about elections. And these elections that we're talking about today are a little strange in that they're an off-year 2023 elections, and they're in the states of Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And we'll go ahead and get into it. I know we have not too much time. We want to keep this short. So we're going to get into Kentucky, where the Democratic governor in Kentucky, yes, Andy Beshear, is looking to win a second term in office in the deep red Kentucky. Mr. Beshear is facing the Attorney General of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, and the election will be on November 7th, 2023. And the governor is a Democrat. This is a very conservative state at the federal level. President Trump carried it by 26 points in 2020 and 30 points in 2016. So just going into our real first question about this really confusing race. All of these races have a little bit of a surprise in them in that they're potentially competitive for both parties. Can you just explain the widespread appeal of Governor Beshear, especially since he's a governor he doesn't deviate from the traditional Democratic values of being pro-choice, being pro-labor union, and he's still one of the most popular governors in the country. So how does he embrace the core pillars of the party in such a conservative state?
Well, part of it is that, of course, the state legislature in Kentucky is pretty deeply Republican. And, the governorship of Kentucky is actually one of the weaker governorships just in terms of legislative power, for lack of a way of putting it, because, look, the Kentucky Republicans would have veto-proof majorities under almost any system, but I believe in Kentucky to override a veto, you just need a simple majority vote. So, not only does Beshear not have a cooperative legislature, doesn't have all that much power in working in sort of going over the top of them, which is probably actually kind of politically helpful because whatever positions he may have that align with the National Democratic Party, he can sort of focus his attention on things that are maybe a little bit less sort of with a little partisan tinge. He I think got a lot of credit for some disaster relief response, which is something that can be helpful to governors of both parties to sort of establish kind of a nonpartisan sort of feel. I think he was, remained generally popular throughout COVID, even though Republicans were kind of critical of how he dealt with it in certain ways. He was also coming off of, he defeated Matt Bevin, who was a fairly unpopular Republican governor, and I think that maybe Beshear just added a little stability to the situation after Bevin had kind of a rockier time. So, according to Morning Consult, which is really the only pollster that does like regular approval polling of all the governors, senators across the country, Beshear's numbers are pretty good. And even there was a poll just came out the other day from Signal, which is a Republican firm, that had the horse race tied at, I think it's 47 apiece, which frankly, I think if you're a Democrat and you're tied in a Republican poll, that probably means you're probably doing a little bit better than that. And even in that poll, Beshear's I forget of his favorability approval, but it was path.
Yeah. You're good. You cut out for a second, but you're good. You're fine. Yeah.
But anyway, one of the things I think these races just in general kind of highlight these three gubernatorial races. So they're all red states at the presidential level. very clearly red states at the presidential level, and all three of them, of course, have two Republican senators, and the other statewide elected offices in the states are deeply Republican. But I think Kentucky and Louisiana having Democratic governors, I think does show you that like governors races can be a little bit different, and there are a lot of different reasons as to why Kentucky and Louisiana have the Democratic governors, at least for now. And it's pretty hard to beat an incumbent. And we just saw Laura Kelly, Kansas last year. One of the other kind of dark red state Democratic governors. She had a very tough election, but she ended up gutting it out. And I get, again, that's sort of my outlook for Beshear is right now. But even if he does win, I wouldn't expect it to be.
Yeah. So what can Attorney General Cameron actually do to unseat Governor Beshear? Obviously, and I'm sure one thing Beshear, I don't think we mentioned, his father was also governor, so the name recognition, I'm sure, plays a little bit, gives him maybe a boost. But what can Attorney General Cameron do, especially like, because Governor Beshear, he faced the test in 2019 and he won at the height of President Trump's presidency. So what can Cameron do to really unseat such a popular governor, even though he's a Democrat?
I think you'll see a lot of attempts to nationalize the race. I think Cameron's been sort of talking about some kind of typical kind of Republican talking points about crime and sort of cultural conservatism, or I guess attacking Beshear for being culturally liberal. I suspect you'll see a whole lot more of that. And I think it's just to to try to tie Beshear to the National Democratic Party in Kentucky, which is not popular. I mean, again, it's a state that certainly has trended even more Republican in recent years. I mean, you may recall like Mitch McConnell actually almost lost in 2008. The Democrats were more were much more competitive in what you consider. I mean, Kentucky is not as classically defined as not part of quote unquote the South, but you could sort of have because it wasn't part of the old Confederacy, it was a border state and State of the Union during the Civil War, and the classic definition in the South is the 11 states of the old Confederacy. But a lot of the kind of what we consider sort of like peripheral border South kind of states, like Arkansas and Kentucky and West Virginia, Democrats at the state level actually held up okay in a lot of those states up until basically the Obama presidency. And then you really kind of start to see more of a collapse. And of course, West Virginia has been kind of the most dramatic example of that, where the legislature didn't even flip until in the last decade. And I think that's true at least of the one. I think it's the Kentucky House only flipped within the last 10 years or so. But now those states have become really deeply Republican at the lower levels, whereas some of the other kind of deep South states became more consistent. Like Georgia, for instance, are sort of even moving out of being reliably Republican. And yet there is still room for Democrats to compete for the governorship. I mean, maybe it only works for people named Beshear. And when he's gone, either this time or next time, then it'll sort of just go to be more reliably Republican. But it is just interesting, sort of the subtle differences within what you consider to be kind of like the gray or South, which Kentucky's a part of, and certainly Louisiana and Mississippi are part of.
Yeah. I think the South. I think people in the South have like a little bit of an issue with Kentucky, just for the fact that if you try to order sweet tea in Kentucky, half the places in Kentucky are like, "What is that?" And then the other half really know what's going on. So yeah, I have one more question about Kentucky, and then I'll throw it to Cameron for Mississippi.
I was in South Carolina recently, and I ordered an Arnold Palmer. So
hey,
it was very good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, that's one thing y'all don't have in DC or Virginia, really.
Or anywhere up north, really.
Sweet tea. I went to Chicago a couple weeks ago. No sweet tea. It was disappointing. But one more question on Kentucky. I know we want to stay really micro, but we're gonna go a little macro here. If Governor Beshear can be reelected and he serves a second term, remains pretty popular, which I don't think he'll have a problem doing if he does serve his term. Do you think the Democratic Party looks for him in 2028 as a presidential candidate?
I mean, look, if it is indeed, well, I mean, you figure Biden, even if he loses in 2024, is not going to be on the ballot in 2028. So maybe he would decide to go that route. I certainly don't think he would start as some sort of major contender. I think about some of the, like Jay Inslee, for instance, in Washington, ran in 2020, and was a perfectly state governor and really had no traction. But it could be that the 2028 Democratic presidential it's just really big, and maybe Bashir would be a part of it and end up being an attractive candidate. I don't know. I mean, but again, I don't think he'd be a front runner or whatever. But there was a time, I think, when like Southern governors were kind of in vogue. And I guess Bill Clinton is the most notable example. Al Gore was not a senator, but he was I'm sorry, Al Gore was not a governor, but he was a senator from Tennessee. Jimmy Carter, was the only Democratic president elected between 1968 and 19. But I don't think the party is really that way anymore. I think there's sort of a different kind of path. But part of what made, I think, Clinton and Carter attractive is that they, as Southerners, and as people who were kind of moderates in certain different ways, or at least as maybe not as tied to the National Democratic Party, they did do pretty well in like places like Eastern Ohio, for instance, which is sort of like kind of a Appalachian region, back when Ohio was more electorally important than it is now. But I don't necessarily think that those sorts of candidates are what the party is really looking for at the moment. But maybe he would throw his hat in the ring, and maybe he could be a credible contender.
Yeah, I had forgotten about Governor Inslee. I believe Governor Bullock from Montana also ran that primary. That was a crazy.
Later ran for Senate. Got it fairly late. Then ran a credible contest, but it ended up being like 10-point race.
Yeah. All right, Cam, Mississippi, you're a home state right now.
My adopted home state for the next 4 years. So I do know a little bit about the Mississippi governor campaign. The state of Mississippi, they'll take to the polls on November 7th to vote for their governor. So there's Republican Tate Reeves, who is not term limited, and will likely advance from the August 8th primary. But like kind of next to Alabama, Mississippi is notoriously one of the safest states for Republicans at the federal level. And there's real potential for competitive race in this year's gubernatorial contest due to Governor Reeves' close victory in 2019 against then Attorney General Jim Hood. With a lot of national criticism and outrage over his poor handling of the Jackson water crisis, welfare scandals, as well as the welfare scandals from like high level politicians and just like public figures in the state of Mississippi. And one of the biggest ones that is still talked about, the scandal at Southern Miss with former NFL quarterback Brett Favre. So those have been like a really big like stain on Mr. Reeves's I guess candidacy and legacy as a governor. But the Democratic nominee is not yet official, but it's an overwhelming likelihood that it's going to be Brandon Presley. Yeah. And just a funny side bit, Presley is Elvis Presley's second cousin. I just thought
I didn't know that.
I didn't either. Eshan told me about it.
I looked that up. I was like, oh, hey.
So, maybe he can ride the Elvis wave to governor of Mississippi, but we'll see. But Presley previously served as the mayor of Nettleton, Mississippi, and has touted as a conservative Democrat, which is a blue dog, that can appeal to unhappy Republican voters while maintaining the large Democratic base in the state. So that's just the background for a lot of our listeners on the Mississippi governor campaign. But a couple questions I have is, how do you think Governor Reeves can really do to reshape his public image after, the Southern Miss Brett Favre scandal, the horrible incident with Jackson water crisis, which a lot of my friends down there told me about. So they got, and still it's not as to the level as it was, but it is not repaired. It is not like been completely looked past upon. So how do you think he can really change his image to be a more suitable candidate for governor?
Reeves' approval numbers have been fairly spotty for some of the reasons that you touched on in your description of the contest. I think the morning consult was like every governor over above water in approval, which maybe there's some sort of bias implicit in there that maybe there's something about the approval option in those polls. I don't know. Although a lot of the other non-morning consult approval polling of governors has really been pretty decent too. But Reeves has one of the weaker kind of approval / favorabilities of any governor across the country. But his numbers seem to have stabilized a little bit. He's got a giant war chest. I think Mississippi is a very conservative state. It's very polarized by race. You've got it's almost like if you look at the political map, if you look at like Tate Reeves's victory over Jim Hood in 2019, it's kind of like this West versus East thing, when a lot of the black electorate is in the western part of the state, closer to the Mississippi River, and so a lot of those counties are pretty heavily Democratic, but they're still substantially more white voters in the state. The white voters are pretty overwhelmingly Republican, just that the black voters are pretty overwhelmingly Democratic. It was interesting. I saw something. Brandon Presley announced his run. He got a lot of attention here for the Elvis connections, and he also has been, successful elected official in Mississippi as a Democrat, where that's can be fairly difficult. But some said, I saw some comments like, oh, well, this is the best Democratic gubernatorial candidate they've had in a long time, and it's like, well, 4 years ago, then the sitting attorney general, who was one of the last, or I think for that time was the only elected Democrat in the Deep South, and I mean, Hood was a very well credentialed candidate. He performed okay, but he ended up losing by 5 points. And I think Presley is also a fairly strong Democratic candidate, but whether he's even as strong as Hood was, Reeves, of course, was not an incumbent back then. So those are, sort of, I think illustrates Presley's challenge in this race. I mean, again, certainly Presley has things to run on, as you mentioned. But I also think that, Reeves is an incumbent. The Republican Governors Association, I think, first of all, is going to prioritize making sure that he wins beyond. I'm sure they'll be spending in the other two races as well. But, first and foremost, the outside groups on both the Democratic and Republican side, their incumbent protection operations. And this is the one Republican incumbent on the ballot this time. So, I don't think Reeves will be pressed for resources at all. And again, fundamentally, he's an incumbent governor, and Mississippi is so, could I see Presley getting within single digits? Yeah, I think so. Potentially, winning. I think it's a much heavier lift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have one, I wrote, this is a really convoluted question that I thought of. I think it relates to the media aspect of a race like the Mississippi race, where it should be a shoo-in for the Republican. You would think, at least looking at it from a federal sense. But I mean, every media organization is very partisan at this point. Every large media organization, and there's not really much public discourse, I feel like, especially. I mean, even in Alabama, we had Governor Ivey face Yolanda Flowers, and there was no people talked about the race, but there was no real backing from I mean, because Miss Flowers was a conservative Democrat, that she was pro-life, very conservative. She was someone that actually Democrats were really happy with, but she won the nomination, and there wasn't really much discourse from the news. I think Alabama news is pretty actually heavily out of it on state politics, but they didn't really help voters color in the edges of opposition candidates in any way that was positive. Really, it was definitely negative. And even with Governor Reeves having some of the most high-profile issues in the country right now, I mean, that Brett Favre thing, I've heard Breaking Points talk about Brett Favre 3 times over the last 6 months. It's been crazy. Do you think that the nature of politics, just being so hyper partisan with the media, is enough? Do you think that will be enough just to keep? And obviously, you said you think that Mr. Presley can get within a couple of points, but do you think that by itself could be enough in this race to just keep Reeves in office over someone that's conservative, popular, but a Democrat? That's the blue D, I guess.
I wish people paid more attention to state level politics. I don't think they do. I think that's part of the reason that our politics has gotten so nationalized in so many ways, is that voters just maybe sort of a national lens. Now again, you do still see, like I mentioned before, you do see kind of results in state level races that are maybe a little bit different than what you'd expect. The other thing, your comment reminds me of, this was a comment that Senate races, so this wasn't directly related to gubernatorial races, but I think the overall point's applicable. And the person said something like, yeah, in a Senate race, 90% of what people hear about the race is going to be through paid media. And that's why, I think Reeves can, as long as he puts a good message together through paid media, that might help to ameliorate some of his concerns. Or that even though there are still approval ratings not that great, that at the end of the day, people, enough people in Mississippi just prefer a Republican to a Democrat, And so, again, in all three of these races we're talking about, it's the desire for the Democrats is going to be to localize, and for the Republicans to nationalize, given that if they nationalize it and get people thinking that these races in terms of a kind of a national voting patterns, that's good in a state where your party, predominates. Again, I think Reeves he's probably more vulnerable on paper than he is in actuality, because again, you could look at some of the scandals and his approval numbers and what have you. I thought one thing it was telling was that it seemed like he might have a quality primary chance. Fairly, substantial people in Mississippi Republican circles were thinking of running against Reeves, and none of them decided to ultimately do it, which I think is probably telling that he may be stronger than what you might otherwise think.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, what do you think the big way for Presley to turn this in his favor? Because I know we're talking a lot about, the biggest thing people are going to see about races in the state level are paid media. So what should he do to turn the race? Because I know, on Mississippi Today, a polling, he has about 38% of independents that would vote for him, in the poll, with 42 wanting to vote for Reeves. So what should he do, I guess, instead of focusing toward Republicans, to sway the independent voters his way?
Well, I think he's probably got the right focus. I mean, Presley's been talking a lot about some of these scandals and, just trying to make Reeves into a toxic candidate. And, there are weapons at his disposal to try to do that. Again, I just think it's a heavy lift in that state, but I wouldn't have any advice from Presley other than what he's doing already. Mm-hmm. He's focusing on the things that you would think a challenger would focus on, given that that the incumbent has got some problems. It's just, again, it's difficult. I mean, at least for Democrats, I mean, they do have a real candidate running here. Again, some places they might not. I believe Presley is not supportive of abortion rights, which is also the case for the last race we're going to talk about, the outgoing governor in Louisiana, John Bel Edwards. And in in states that are, I mean, there aren't that many states across the country where you would say that the where the maybe the pro-life, anti-abortion rights position is more popular than the pro-choice, pro-abortion rights position. But some of the states where you probably would say popular, states like Mississippi and Louisiana, that are just very culturally conservative. And you do have, both the states are very racially polarized, and the political preferences of the white voters, who tend to be much more Republican, predominate. But even among the voters who might be Democratic leaning, some black voters in particular, you might still see some support for social conservatism among those voters too, or at least to maybe a greater degree than you might see in a lot of other parts, looking at the Democratic voter base. So, Presley is, he's an interesting candidate. He's got interesting positions on these things, but again, it's just heavy lift. I don't think the Democrats have won this governor's race since, I think it was 1999 was the last time. Again, Presley's a perfectly credible candidate. Reeves got some problems, but we do our ratings for these races. We have as likely Republican, so maybe a little bit of sliver for Presley, but still Reeves clearly favored.
No. All right, are you going to Mississippi?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Louisiana. Louisiana is a weird one. They're so like you said, Governor John Bel Edwards, Democrat, incumbent, is term limited, so he's out. There's always a lot of challengers in Louisiana. They have a strange primary system called a jungle primary, where all the candidates in the race are on the same ballot, and then the top two, if necessary, will go to runoff if no one reaches the 50% required. So the vote itself is scheduled for October 14th, with a runoff, if necessary, on November 18th. So to set the scene, Governor Edwards, he's one of the few prominent Democrats in the country that are still pro-life, and that actually really helped in 2015 and 2019 in such a conservative state. In 2015, he won with 56% of the vote. So he did a pretty good job. And it was closer in 2019, 51%. President Trump actually campaigned on Eddie Rispone, the businessman he ran against, on his behalf a lot, and Governor Edwards still came through. And actually, one thing that's interesting about Governor Edwards is he signed the 6-week abortion ban back in 2019, which was actually overturned by a federal judge in the I think it was the District of Southern Mississippi. So there's a lot of interesting issues with this race. just from like the macro level, having a jungle primary, but also going into like the Republicans have had some problems in this race. The candidate the party endorsed, they did it in a closed door meeting, which kind of swayed a lot of people the wrong way, especially the other people running in that election.
And it also looked like a bad taste in people's mouths.
Yeah, I think
how they did it. Yeah,
there's a lot of like stereotypes of New Orleans and corruption, so it's kind of like,
and they're definitely feeding into it, not in a positive light.
Yeah. And the Democratic frontrunner, they endorsed Jeff Landry, the Attorney General, and then the frontrunner on the Democratic side is Sean Wilson. He was the former Secretary of the Department of Transportation and Development until March 2023. Governor Edwards endorsed him, and the lone Democrat in the congressional delegation, Congressman Troy Carter, endorsed him as well. So this one's a weird one. There's a lot of info here for all of our listeners, and obviously I'm sure you know this all, Kyle, but it seems unlikely, honestly, that Democrats can hold this seat with Edwards leaving office. Do you see any pathway for most likely Mr. Wilson to cater to voters and maybe hold the seat?
I would say that, it's not like Sean Wilson is a household name or anything, although I don't necessarily know if John Bel Edwards was either at this point of 2015. And, John Bel Edwards benefited from, David Vitter being his opponent in the runoff after the primary. Vitter had a tough competition against other Republicans. Vitter had lots of problems. Also, the state was coming off of 2 terms of Bobby Jindal as the governor, Republican, who was pretty unpopular. And so, Edwards was able to sort of parlay all of that into a pretty impressive victory. And then again, as you mentioned, won by a much closer margin in 2019. There have been some fireworks in this race, at least recently. I mean, I'd say describe, Attorney General Jeff Landry, who's kind of a harder right kind of candidate, I think, than some other Republicans in the state. And there's been this air war starting between him and his allies and supporters of Stephen Wagensbeck, who he is connected to Bobby Jindal. He used to work for Jindal when Jindal was governor, that he was most recently in charge of basically business advocacy organization. But there's been some back and forth. Where Bobby Jindal has come up, and attacks that Landry is making, attacks that Landry over crime. So there's a lot going on, but ultimately, you'd expect whoever emerges out of the Republican side to ultimately win this race. We have this as a likely Republican takeover. You could sort of look at it as being similar to like when Massachusetts and Maryland elected Democratic governors following the exits of the popular moderate Republican incumbents in those states in 2022. Same kind of thing. John Bel Edwards is reasonably popular. He's is forced to leave office, and so you'd sort of think it was natural for Republicans to sort of to flip this one. But there is some there's some worry about that House Majority Leader Steve Scalise from Louisiana has expressed about just the infighting going on here. But ultimately, I think there are a lot of candidates just besides Landry, but other Republicans, Wagspack and others who are running, that this nomination or getting to the runoff is an opportunity of a lifetime, really, because you're going to be favored to be the next governor of the state. So again, there are some other candidates who entered, but Landry, again, seems like the leading person here.
Yeah. I honestly don't know much about Louisiana. I don't really, I know like the primary system is really odd. I think it's interesting to have a jungle primary, but
that's the only thing I know about it is the jungle primary.
Yeah. There's not much. Louisiana is like a real outlier in this sense of the word. What do you have Louisiana rated as for the viewers?
Likely Republican, and its system is different than any other state in the country. Now you do have, like Washington and California have a top 2 system. However, in Washington, California, there's always going to be a second round of voting. There's the primary in June and then the general in November. And even if someone gets, 90% of the vote or something, the second place person advances. In this race, you could have someone just get 50% plus 1, and then the race would be over. Now, again, I wouldn't expect that to happen, but that is a possibility. I think there's probably enough of a Democratic base that you'd expect Democrat to get through to the runoff. I guess it's possible that you could even see 2 Republicans make it. Although what you probably expect is that if the Republican primary, there are several candidates that the Republican vote would make up well north of 50% of the total vote, but none of those individual candidates would get to 50%. Probably would finish, would not finish first, even though they'd be favored to win in the second round. I think for Democrats, it's kind of it's a story we've seen told many times, in that they basically hope that Landry is kind of too far right, and that he kind of kicks away a general election or the runoff if it gets there. I personally think that I don't really see that at this point. But again, there's been some activity there. But this is still the most if you look at the 2-year gubernatorial cycle, most of the governor's races are in the midterm year. But if you look at 2023 and 2024 here, this is the most obvious pickup opportunity for either side.
Yeah. So I think that concludes all the topics we want. Those
we'll read 2 generals.
Yeah, we have 2 general questions that just to relate the 2023 elections here to the the 2024. Now that we're all in election mode, it seems like in the political world, we're starting to think about it. So Cameron, go ahead with the first question.
Yeah. So I guess just a general question overall. What themes do you expect these 2023 gubernatorial elections to carry over and translate into 2024?
I think you'll see a lot of the kind of standard kind of red meat conservative messaging for Republican candidates that, I think some of it will mimic probably what you're going to be hearing in the Republican primary. You got to remember all 3 of these states are pretty Republican at the federal level. So you might be hearing some sort of similar themes. In terms of, I don't think the results would necessarily be predictive of the future. I do think, in Kentucky, you have seen in the last several cycles that, the party that wins in Kentucky has gone on to win the presidential election. I don't think there's really any actual connection there. But, if maybe it'll tell us a little bit about the political environment, maybe the other kind of state level elections that I'll certainly be watching and others are watching are the, Virginia state legislative races. Obviously, the governor is not in the statewide elected, it's not on the ballot, but the control about the state house and the state senate are up for grabs. But, even then, Republicans had a great election in Virginia in 2021. And, they didn't really have that great of an election overall in 2022. They did at certain places, but, overall, it wasn't that good of a performance. So I wouldn't use this necessarily as anything predictive about the future. And again, it's sort of skewed in that, we're going to be analyzing these 3 gubernatorial elections, all of which are in states that are going to vote very comfortably Republican for president in 2024. So how much can you really take from that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we'll leave it with that, actually, kind of answer our second question. So Kyle Kondik, the leader on American elections, guys. Thank you for being here, Mr. Kondik. Where can everybody find you and your work?
Centerforpolitics.org, / Crystal Ball. You can sign up for our newsletter there. We come out usually twice a week. And still active on Twitter, I guess, even though the platform is taking on water lately, but at K Kondik. So anyway, nice talking to you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
They had RFK on Twitter today. We missed it 1 p.m.
Yeah.
So I'll watch.
I guess you were recording, I think, while that happened on Shocks.
Although last time they took like an hour to get started, so
we may be getting on just in time.
Might be just in time.
That is true.
Yeah. All right. Well,
the whole DeSantis thing was it was just kind of a bizarre conversation, whatever you think about it.
Yeah.
But anyway, nice talking to you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you
too. Thank you, Mr. Kondik. You guys know where to find us, pvpolitical.al, pvpolitical.com. Stay with us as we get ramping up to the 2024 election. That's about everything. I'm Eshan Pokhrel.
My name's Cameron Cummings.
And goodbye.